And then the terror just expanded until hundreds of thousands of people were arrested and executed.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today we have a founding father of Alaska, the last living signer of our state's constitution, Victor Fischer. Mr. Fischer was born in Berlin, Germany, to a Russian mother and an American father in 1924. Today, he recounts his childhood, growing up in both Germany, as Hitler took power, and Russia under Josef Stalin. As you heard in the opening clip, he will discuss the atrocities that he observed firsthand before his dramatic evacuation to America as a teenager. He covers this period in vivid detail in his remarkable 2012 autobiography, co-written with Charles Wohlforth, To Russia with Love, An Alaskan's Journey. This interview was recorded via Zoom.
My father was born in Philadelphia, a very poor family. They struggled. He got some education. He became a teacher. Then he became a journalist, went to New York, worked for a newspaper, followed my mother, whom he had met in New York. And she had been born in Tsarist Russia, in sort of a middle-class family, and had a good education. And she ended up in New York as a translator and interpreter. And she knew Russian and German and French, and then picked up Italian and other languages too. And they met in New York when she was there during World War I.
You wrote on page 14 of your memoir, "My mother easily fell in with a bohemian set of young intellectuals in Greenwich Village, including Emma Goldman. In her later life, she enjoyed telling young people that the sex and drugs in the village during World War I surpassed anything imagined by the beat or hippie generations decades later." Here's a clip from the 1930s of your mom's friend, the notorious anarchist Emma Goldman.
Ms. Goldman, should the government here object to your speeches of anarchism, would you change them or leave the country?
I will leave the country rather than deny my ideas. I prefer to stick to my guns.
So your mother actually helped your father's career in the beginning because she had these connections. She was able to introduce him to these famous people.
Right, very much so. She was interpreter for Soviet delegation after World War I at peace conferences and the negotiations between the Russians and the Germans, or the Russians and the Americans, and she was right there in the middle of the action, interpreting and translating for the Russian foreign minister. It was through her that my father, Louis Fischer, got to travel to Moscow as early as 1922 and ended up in a meeting sitting just a few chairs away from Lenin, meeting other top officials, and in short order, he became one of the leading American journalists in Russia, wrote books about petroleum development and about foreign politics.
This is a good spot to interrupt to say that Vic's father, Louis Fischer, won the National Book Award in 1965 for his biography of Vladimir Lenin, and later wrote The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, which was made into the Academy Award-winning 1982 film starring Ben Kingsley. Most of the time, it seems that it was you and your brother and your mother. Can you talk a little bit about your childhood and what it was like in Moscow in those years?
Well, initially, I was in Moscow and was in kindergarten, spoke fluent Russian, was essentially in view of my mother's Russian passport, and I was a Russian kid. And so was my brother, who was a year older. We lived like Russians, occasionally had decent lodgings, and other time we lived in slum conditions like most people in Moscow did in those years. This was the 1920s. We went through all the childhood illnesses, problems, getting enough food, decent food. Then our mother decided to send us to Germany to stay with middle-class German couple whom they had met in Moscow. We went to German school, elementary school, and relearned German. That language stayed with us for many, many years.
Right. And Paul Massing was your like surrogate father in a way. You had a very close relationship with him that lasted for a long time, correct?
Yes, that is certainly true. He was a wonderful human being who knew how to take care of bright young boys, and he loved us. We loved him. Our father was very, very involved in his work. He would travel to the United States, go on a lecture circuit, travel around the United States, and lecture about European politics, about Russia, and whatever topic was pertinent at the time. And he would spend maybe a third of each year in the United States. Then he'd travel around Europe, meeting very important people, and he sort of reached the top of reputation where he could contact an important person in government or in industry and not be rejected. He would be able to interview them, write interesting articles, write books. He wrote a total of about 25 books in his life. And so he was visible, and he spent relatively small amounts of time with the family.
There was one period of time when he came to live with you in Moscow, and you got to live in a really great house, like that was very close to Red Square. I think you were invited to stand near Stalin at like the May Day parade, the anniversary of the October Revolution. Do you remember those standing at the parades near Stalin?
Oh, yes, I remember that. There's a mausoleum where the body of Lenin lies, and right next to the mausoleum were places for foreign journalists. So we got to be within 100 feet or so of Stalin, where he stood up on the mausoleum, taking the parades, and the other Soviet leaders were right up there, and we would see them. That was strictly because our father was a very important person.
Here is a little clip of Stalin speaking at one of these events. The translation is roughly, "Death to German armies, long live our motherland, her independence, her freedom, onward to victory under Lenin."
Смерть немецким оккупантам! Да здравствует наша славная Родина, ее свобода, ее независимость. Под знаменем Ленина вперед, победа!
Your father, it was in your book, he had a pretty famous affair with Stalin's daughter. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. In
Svetlana.
fact, that was written up in Time magazine at the time when Louis dropped her, got rid of her. But while they still had the affair going, I went to Princeton, where my father was, and in New Jersey, and my father said, "We're going to have dinner tonight with Svetlana Alliluyeva." That's Stalin's daughter.
Right.
So I had dinner with her too.
Let's get back to Germany. In the early 30s, the Nazis were coming into power, and you and your brother George were living in Berlin with the Massings. You and George had to be smuggled out of the country, I presume because you were Jewish, but you didn't know that you were Jewish. Your mother was actually descended from a long line of rabbis in Latvia. Can you talk about how you found out you were Jewish and what that meant to you?
This was sort of an interesting element. My brother and I were taken out of Germany and we went to Czechoslovakia. Our mother came to visit one time, and she took me to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, and we went on a tour. We'd get out of the tour bus, go look at the interesting places and so on. At one stop, I dragged along. I was getting tired of just looking at places, and was slow following them. All of a sudden, there's this great big tall man, all in black, and he says to me in German, "Bist du Jüdisch? Are you Jewish?" And I looked at him, and I didn't know what it meant to be Jewish, and I said, "No, nein, no." And then when we got back on the bus, I told my mother about this guy and asked her, "What did he mean?" And so then she explained, "Yes, we are Jewish." She might have explained a little bit more. It didn't mean a damn thing to me because in the circles where we were, religion was not significant. Being Jewish meant nothing to me. And it wasn't really until many years later I came to the United States and went to high school. And then there were Catholic holidays and Jewish holidays. And so I started realizing that there are sort of whole populations of different religious foundations. And in my life has not meant anything in particular. I've never been religious one way or the other. And sort of being Jewish has never been a problem.
Well, you know what? It was a problem when you were in Anchorage and you and Gloria wanted to adopt a baby. Early, they said that you needed to adopt a Jewish baby, and there wasn't a Jewish baby available. Is that something like that? So that did come into play.
That's right. And I was real pissed because it didn't make any difference to us what the background of the child would be. It didn't matter if it was a native kid or a black kid or a Catholic child. And some social worker in government said, "Well, we have to match the child with you." So I gave up, and I told let the word out with doctors and lawyers in Anchorage saying, if there's a child available for adoption, let me know. And that's how we got 3 kids whom we adopted, and they were our children.
Yes, sir. So I'd like to go back to Moscow. So after Czechoslovakia, you ended up back in Moscow and you went to school there. And when your father would come to visit, I think your parents would host parties. And I remember in the book that the first Black man you ever saw was Paul Robeson. Do you remember seeing Paul Robeson and hearing him sing?
I think if you ever saw Paul Robeson, you would remember him. He was a great big man with a great big voice. And when he sang, which he did at one party, I remember the first time I saw him, he had this phenomenal voice.
I'm tired of living and scared of dying, but old man River, he just keeps rolling on.
Very attractive. And when years later, my brother and I and our mother did come to the United States, George and I used to visit the family on Central Park West.
During this period when you were in Moscow going to school, this was the period in the 30s where Stalin had begun his purges, and you had your 2 best friends, Lothar and Coney. Yeah. Lothar lost his father in the purges, correct?
Started his dictatorial life in the early 1930s, at first very quietly, and then massive arrests and executions of people. The father of one of my friends, Lothar, was a communist worker. He worked for the International Communist Organization, trying to bring communism to the rest of the world. And Stalin and his secret police, the GPU, were essentially killing off the real dedicated communists. It was just a crazy era, and it started with one assassination of the head of the Leningrad Communist Party, and then the terror just expanded until hundreds of thousands of people were arrested and executed. Hundreds of thousands were exiled to camps in the Arctic and the Far East. It was fear. It lasted 5, 6, 7 years continuously.
I'd like to read just a little bit from your book about this time. From page 54. Often, agents and regional offices were given quotas of arrests. Officials competed to beat their quotas, receiving promotions when they did so. Those who failed could be executed themselves. Agents couldn't possibly produce enough executions by snatching real or perceived enemies. They needed more names. One of my classmates lost an uncle who was a tough manager at work when an employee he had disciplined reported him as a traitor. Anyone could settle a grudge with a word to the GPU. When that didn't produce enough victims, GPU agents flipped through telephone books to pick out names at random. To keep up with the arrests, huge execution grounds were established in the countryside behind fences where local people could hear but not see the pleading of the condemned. All night long, lines of men and women would receive one gunshot to the back of the head, mass graves spread year by year. A set of graves near Minsk ultimately contained 250,000 corpses.
It was when World War II broke out that slowed down. After the war, Stalin went crazy again, and there were hundreds of thousands more victims. It was just horrible. And Lothar's father, who was a dedicated communist, was one of those who was arrested and executed. And Connie's father was a doctor and an author, wrote books. He happened to be trying to get to Spain in the late 1930s during the Civil War in Spain. And he was arrested on the French border, imprisoned in France. So he was not in Russia to be executed. He probably would have been, because he was a dedicated communist and an intellectual, was pretty much of a free thinker, and that kind of people didn't survive.
And Coney's father had become famous because he had published a book on nudism, correct? And they had done photos of him and his children doing exercises, calisthenics in the nude. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, and that was published in Germany before Hitler took over. So that was an era of peace where people such as Connie's father were able to function and live their lives in peace.
So back in Moscow, the Massings came to stay for a time with you, and your mother hid their papers and their passports, and she showed you where those papers were, but she didn't want to show your brother George.
My brother, from the time I remember, was very active, very aggressive. He became a true believer in communism, in leadership, in Stalin. I was interested in technology and sort of physical things that one could do. I was interested in Arctic exploration around the world. And but George was always an activist. He wanted to be the youngest member of the Russian Communist Party, and I was aware of all the political stuff going on around. I was not interested in communist politics and so on. My two friends, Connie and Lothar, and I were just amazed when Stalin, when we saw a notice in a Moscow newspaper that the marshals, who were the highest-ranking military people, were arrested and executed. And they were our heroes. We just couldn't believe that the regime had gone that deep and executed the leaders of the military might of the Soviet Union. So far as George was concerned, my brother, if they were arrested and executed, they were guilty. And there were preposterous accusations of how these marshals made deals with Japan and with Germany, and that they were traitors and had to be shot. Belota, Connie, and I, we just wouldn't believe it. But we were interested in football and soccer and Arctic exploration. That was our interest.
Well, you wrote that it was one of the happiest times of your life. Like you were with your friends, you were going to the countryside on the weekends. You were enjoying your life while this was kind of happening around you in the background.
Well, initially, I was in a German language school in Moscow, and there were a lot of German emigres who had left Hitler Germany and ended up in Moscow, and their children and the children of Russians who wanted them to have a foreign language went to the German school. And I didn't feel comfortable because I felt myself of being a Russian, and my Russian was pure and
was your mother tongue
perfect. During the era of these purges, when people were being arrested, a lot of the German teachers who were teaching in the German school were arrested and disappeared. And eventually the German school was closed. I ended up in a Russian school, a wonderful Russian school where I was with a group of pure, sort of, you might say, pure Russians who were just wonderful human beings, where I felt comfortable because I considered myself Russian at that stage. I had the joy of having two wonderful friends, Lothar and Connie, plus having a Russian class, bunch of Russian kids who accepted me, because when they heard that there was son of an American coming to their school, they wondered what kind of a creature that's going to be. Well, they found when they met me that my Russian was as good as theirs, and I fit in perfectly. So I felt that my feet were on the Russian ground when I went to a Russian school.
So speaking of being the son of an American, your mother was the wife of an American. And it seems to me that during this period, that would be sort of a dangerous place to be because there was so much suspicion of foreigners. And of course, she had a very difficult and treacherous time trying to arrange the exit from the country. Were you aware, or do you think your mother was protected by being the wife of an American, or do you think it made her position more precarious?
It made her position precarious. It also exposed her to the secret police going after her. She was told by phone to show up at midnight. There'll be a black car in front of your apartment building, and they will take you for an interview. When you got that kind of a request, you show up. And she showed up, and they took her to the secret police headquarters, talked to her for hours, but then brought her back. She was sure that she was being arrested, and that she imagined how her two sons were going to lose the apartment. They'll be sent off to camps in Siberia. And so she was scared. She was just devastated. But then they brought her home, and they said, "We will talk to you again, and we will call you by 11 o'clock in the morning if we want to talk to you. And so she had to stay near her phone until 11 a.m. and about 10:59, the phone would ring, and they said, "Tonight we will send a vehicle for you, and we'll talk to you again." And this went on for months.
And and as a child, were you aware that this was happening? I mean,
I was not. No, I was not aware. Our friends, the Germans to whom my mother had sent us in the 1930s, had come to Moscow, and my mother took me aside and showed me where their passports were, and other papers were in a volume of Lenin's collected works, sort of a whole dozens of books. In volume 22 were their passports and their papers. And I was instructed that if my mother, Markusha, were not with us anymore, and that I heard that the Mossings were being arrested, I should take those passports and papers and take them to the residence of the American ambassador, whose house was not far from where we lived. I could walk in there as a kid who was often at the ambassador's residence, where they showed Charlie Chaplin and other American movies. And I was a movie lover as a kid. And so I could walk into the residence past the guards. And my mother said, "Don't take it to the official embassy, just to the residence."
mm-hmm.
And she said, "And whatever you do, don't tell your brother,
Mm-hmm.
George, about that." And because he is not trustworthy, as described in my book, there was an exchange between Paul Mossing
Mm-hmm.
and George, where I think you mentioned that,
Mm-hmm.
where Paul said, "If I'm arrested, do you think I'm guilty?" And George said, "Yes, of course." And that's where his mind was.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about how your family got to the United States, how you got out of Russia?
Well, things got awful. My mother had applied for an exit visa, permission to leave Russia, the Soviet Union, and she was kept on a string for months and months. And finally, then she was called in and came out in tears. They denied her permission to leave the country. One of the things was that when she was being called in by the secret police, they kept one of the things they kept asking is, why doesn't Louis, her husband, why doesn't he write about Russia anymore? And he was involved in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, and that was very important to him. But he also wouldn't come back to Russia because of the horrible situation and the execution of many of the people whom he had trusted, who were top echelon government officials. They were executed. They were tried in public, and Louis just wasn't going to write about Russia anymore. And so anyway, so she was turned down. She could not leave. And I should mention that they said, well, if we give you permission to leave, would you report to us on Russians who are in America or in Europe, sort of they want to make a spy of her? And she said no, she would not do that. She came out of the office, and I could tell that she was completely broken up. And so I suggested that we are right close to the circus, and why don't we get tickets to go to the circus tonight? And that sort of calmed her down long enough to get the tickets. And Connie and Lothar, my friends, took them to the circus, and that lightened the situation. But she was getting desperate because people around her were disappearing, and everybody had to report to the secret police and any contacts that they had, and you couldn't trust anybody. She would write to our father, who was in Spain or in America or in England or France or somewhere where he was safe. At one point, realized that she's going to commit suicide if she's not arrested. He contacted Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, whom he had talked a year earlier about the Spanish Civil War and about supporting the Republic of Spain that was being attacked by Franco and supported by the armies and air forces of Italy and Germany. He had talked to Eleanor Roosevelt about the problem of getting arms to the Republic.
Here is an interview with Eleanor Roosevelt from the late 50s during the Red Scare, which was started by Senator Joseph McCarthy. For the record, Victor Fischer made it out of the USSR in 1939, years before this interview, and he was a U.S. citizen and should not have had so much difficulty getting into the United States.
Our government has always felt that we lived in a free country. Anyone who wanted to come could come. Now, we don't allow communists to come without special permission, but other people can come.
But aren't the communists the very people who should be coming?
Oh, yes, of course, but that hasn't dawned upon... Mr. McCarthy did us harm that way. It hasn't dawned upon people that actually we're strong enough to allow the communists to come and to show them what we have of value to show.
So he sent her a message that he would like to talk to her about his family that is stuck in Russia. And she responded, come to the White House, and he met with her, explained the situation, that my mother would not be allowed to leave, and the boys could not leave. And we were, within a few years, would be military age. She said, I understand. I'll talk to the president and let you know. And she, Eleanor Roosevelt, talked to the President Roosevelt, and he invited a Russian ambassador's wife to the White House for tea, which she did, and she passed on that the president would like the Soviet government to let the Fischer family come to America. And within 2 weeks, we were out of the country and lived happily ever after.
Normally on this podcast, we have a commentary reflecting on the interview that we had just heard. Today, Victor Fischer himself will give the commentary by reading from a commencement address he gave to the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2009.
In the end, I found I had two essential things to say. I encouraged the graduates to find, evolve, and strengthen their values and to live by them. And I demanded of them generous participation in their state and their community with responsibility to their fellow citizens. I told them of my deepest values: respect for individual rights, abhorrence of the state power to kill its citizens, opposition to all forms of insidious discrimination due to race, gender, sexual orientation, or any other such characteristic. I'm dedicated to those without power, the poor, the underdog. I believe in fairness and equality. These are basic humanistic beliefs and may seem self-evident in this first part of the 21st century. But for most of the 20th century, they were matters of deep and terrible conflicts. As bleak as the world often seems today, it has improved. We are making progress.
Mr. Fischer, this has been just wonderful. I can't thank you enough for doing this interview today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm delighted, and I'm glad you're interested.
Thank you to all our listeners for tuning into the podcast today. Special thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this listenable. We also host Zoom events. Please visit eastanchoragebbookclub.com for more information. Victor Fischer will be our guest again in early January to discuss Alaska in the 1950s and the drafting of our state constitution. However, in 2 weeks, our next guest is Melanie Banky, president of Cowarak in Nome, who recently served on the state's redistricting board. Please tune in.